This is episode 98 of That Shakespeare Life.
This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Mira Caffin-Terrace. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of English at Ohio State. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
If you saw them performing by themselves throughout the countryside or even in the courts, especially those traveling from Europe, then what you would expect to see is just feats of activity. You would see in the same day rope dancing, vaulting, mauling, and whatever other skill, contortion certainly, that the tumblers were capable of. And it would sort of be an all-day thing, much like we think of the circus now.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Biron in Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost declares, "Oh, my little heart, and I to be a corporal of his field and wear his colours like a tumbler's hoop." And in Romeo and Juliet, there are stage directions which call for Romeo to, quote, "He climbs the wall and leaps down within it." These references to leaping and tumbling have gone largely overlooked by theater companies who perform these plays, being glossed over in the dialogue, or constraints of the theater space itself can determine what precisely it looks like for Romeo to leap down a wall. But our guest this week, Dawn Tucker, executive director of the Flagstaff Shakespeare Festival, has done research into the Elizabethan history of leaping, tumbling, and feats of activity on stage in Shakespeare's lifetime, and she discovered that acrobats were actually a key part of Elizabethan theater. Tumblers, as they were called, traveled to England from places like Italy, and the records of performance for playing companies like the Queen's Men, which we find from Masters of the Rebels or chamber accounts, show that acrobats were employed in theaters and that death-defying leaps of acrobatics and performance were a much more regular part of performances in plays like Hamlet, As You Like It, and even Romeo and Juliet than we might have previously considered. I had the pleasure of hearing Dawn speak on this topic of acrobatics in Shakespeare's England at the Blackfriars Conference last year, and I'm delighted to welcome her here to the studio today to share with us what she found inside the Master of the Revel accounts and the Chambers archive about Shakespeare's performance history. Having grown up in Flagstaff, Dawn's lifelong dream has been to bring her passion for Shakespeare to her beautiful hometown. In 2015, Dawn did just that by founding the Flagstaff Shakespeare Festival and is the current executive director. Dawn has a master's degree in Shakespeare and performance from the American Shakespeare Center in partnership with Mary Baldwin University and a BFA in theater performance from the University of Wisconsin. She worked for 5 years as an actor and the director of education for Southwest Shakespeare Company in Mesa, Arizona. Hello, Dawn. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
You've recently been researching tumblers in Elizabethan England, and has your research led you to conclude that theater was much more of an athletic sport in the 16th century than we may have been giving it credit for being?
Yes. It's led me to believe both that it was a lot more athletic in general than we give it credit for being, but also that human spectacle was an integral part of performance, especially stage and theater performance, than we had any idea before.
What kinds of feats of activity were performed on stage during a performance? Will you give us some examples from Shakespeare's plays where you believe acrobatics and tumbling might have been used?
Yeah, so there's a couple of distinct, I think, sort of groups of feats of activity. So I would call, one is sort of like heaven and hell, splendor and awe kind of thing. So we might see things like goddesses descending from the sky, demons coming up from the underworld, those sorts of things that I think tumblers would have been involved in and able to make more otherworldly for the audience participating. There's another set, which is sort of like, I describe it as early modern WWF. So if we think of things like the wrestling scene in As You Like It, that would give us a really good idea of another thing that tumblers did, which was called mauling, which was essentially the sport of wrestling or fighting, but where, it was all pretend. There was no outcome in which someone actually got hurt because they were doing it over and over and over again for an audience. And then the final one are things like the French leap over the walls or the little boy falling piano. And there's ample evidence for them being involved in are actually moments like dumb shows. So it's very possible that the group of players who show up in the middle of Hamlet were some sort of tumblers. They often did what was called a show of motion without any words in it, but which told a story. So it's possible that they could have been participating in those dumb shows, but I don't have any hard or fast evidence of that.
When I first heard Dawn present on this topic, I questioned the presence of tumblers in the theater because so many of her historical references referred to tumbling as something children did, almost like a playground activity. In my mind, that was in opposition to the idea of a professional theater actor. But afterwards, when I was ruminating over this presentation, I realized that for Shakespeare, actors were oftentimes children. Dawn, do you think the reality of players often being young boys in Shakespeare's theater supports the idea of playing companies, including acrobatics?
I do, but it's not exclusive and the lines aren't quite that clear. So you can't say, that children were the tumblers in the plays. Tumblers were often groups of men who were paid and treated in the same way that groups of actors were. So we have to assume that they were primarily adults, just based on the way that they're treated in Elizabethan society and Elizabethan record keeping. Whenever we have references to tumblers, there are usually a very clear denotation if there's something other than an adult male. So a young woman who tumbled, a child who tumbled, which also seems to indicate that everyone else who's tumbling is an adult male. And that's why it's, interesting to say, oh, but this time it was a child. On the other hand, children were trained to tumble. And so the one extant tumbling manual from the time, it is, primarily, again, grown men who are doing the tumbling in the manual, but they're also training young children. So I found it very interesting because I had a conversation at the conference with Darren Freeberry Jones, and he's writing a book right now about children's playing companies. And one thing that he pointed out to me is that there's a stage direction that specifically calls for two young boys to tumble down the walls in a play. So I thought he and I both thought that was quite interesting that the verbiage tumble is used there. And certainly like the little boy in King John could have been a child tumbler, or almost certainly was a child tumbler. It doesn't seem that there's a big overlap between who's tumbling and who's doing the primary acting. They were working together as a troupe, but the skills were still specific enough that you'll notice a lot of those roles and parts that I mentioned earlier that might call for tumblers aren't very heavy acting roles. Some of them have some lines, some of them have a speech or two. Usually the way those speeches are written are a little more sing-songy, especially in the case of the goddesses, or they're given sort of abstract shouts, as in the case of the French coming over the walls. So it seems that the company was working together. It's very possible that tumblers were also training actors to do some feats of activity, but we might look at it more like the Hollywood model of actor and stuntman, if that makes sense.
It does. Like there's a specific place for a tumbler in the troupe, and that was built into the production. Like there's an expectation of tumbling and acrobatics as part of the play.
Yes, exactly.
Dawn cites an instance from 1631 where Cicely Peedle, her husband Thomas, and their son Elias were granted an official license to perform, which any performance group of any sort had to have in order to be considered legitimate as opposed to vagrants. And Dawn cites this license in particular, though, because it includes a reference to specific permission for their company to perform, quote, dancing on ropes, tumbling, vaulting, or any such feats that they are practicing, end quote. Dawn, this reference is impressive, but also 20 years after Shakespeare died, which, while not a long time after his death numerically, we do know that the late 1600s were substantially different in many ways from the late 1500s when Shakespeare had what you might call his heyday in London performing plays. What makes you think tumbling and acrobatics was part of the early modern performance repertoire as opposed to an invention of the later Carolinian period, which was known for taking a distinctly different approach to theater than Shakespeare himself would have done?
Well, so most of my records come from a much earlier time period, and they're actually records that are in conjunction with playing companies we would recognize. So some records like that one I pulled outside of the era, both before and after Shakespeare's time, but I stuck really closely to sort of the heyday of Elizabethan theater. And I would say of the, 88 records that I found in the records of early English drama, which I'm sure there are more than that. I had to search it at a time when it wasn't yet digitized. I'd love to go back now that it is, but I haven't had the opportunity. I'm too busy running a theater company. So most of them are inside of that period. And the reason I cite the reference from Cicely is that I think it's really fascinating that she was licensed as a woman, which I just thought was fantastic because, as you mentioned, it is after Shakespeare's time, but not so much so that it isn't still rather shocking to see a woman being licensed to perform.
That was my favorite part of it too, I have to say, because I think we have this assumption that women were not part of the performance repertoire, and for her to be kind of the lead on who was licensed here to do this was, I loved that part of that reference in particular.
There's another lovely reference from the 1700s that essentially says, why shouldn't we see feats of activity on stage again, like they used to be? And so I think that that's another good indicator. But a stronger indicator are the records that I have from the time period Shakespeare was alive, that Elizabethan period. There's a plethora of references, especially in the chamber accounts and the Masters of Revels accounts, where players and tumblers are paid together for performances, and also with such companies as the Queen's Men.
And we'll link to some of these references where you can see the ones from Shakespeare's lifetime that Dawn's talking about in the show notes for today's episode. In the late 1580s, one of the best-known actors from the Commedia dell'arte in Italy was a man named Harlequin, who was a comic servant character, not unlike Falstaff, but he was known for being very good at both acting and specifically acrobatics. Dawn, do you think Shakespeare would have been influenced by the theater going on in Italy and specifically by the famed acrobatics of Harlequin?
I think Shakespeare would have been influenced maybe even more prevalently by traveling acrobats than the theater taking place. Certainly he could have seen some plays that were making it across to England, having no proof of Shakespeare traveling himself to Europe. It's hard to say how much of that theater was he cognizant of and, in the way that it was being presented or the style, other than what made it to England. And we know that a lot of Italian tumblers made it to England. Of course, one of the fascinations would have been that their technique and their repertoire would have been different than English tumblers. Tumbling is such a vague term or description for what people could do. It's a lot like us saying acrobats. It means just a myriad of things. And so you'll see lots of references, especially to Italian tumblers. Now, they weren't performing as much in the plays, though at one point the Queen's Men do pick up a Turkish tumbler and have him as part of their troupe for quite a while. So some of these traveling tumblers were directly influencing the theater by participating in theater. A lot of them were more doing acts that were just tumbling, or I would even categorize it as just feats of activity, just human spectacle with the body that people were coming to watch, that didn't necessarily include a storyline, that wasn't inside of a play, that wasn't part of anything other than what we might think of more as like a traveling circus.
Do you think it's like an early modern Cirque du Soleil?
Yes, it's more like that. And it's very much an early modern just circus, which is another fascination of mine, is the circus. And the circus in England started in the 1700s with a lot of animal acts, bareback riding and that kind of thing. But those circus families, sort of like the Patel family, were traveling and working in England and Europe for hundreds of years before the circus became its own sort of form of entertainment. And they would set up in the town square and they would sort of, present that day to the people feats of activity. It's interesting because the revels and chamber accounts give us the best records of tumblers working with players and playing companies. And the sort of, different county accounts from Reed give us the best descriptions of what tumblers were doing. So a lot of what I would do in my work is try to overlap those and then figure out where the skills were being used and weren't being used. For example, I don't know that a lot of rope dancing was happening inside the Elizabethan theater. However, the way the theater is structured allows for rope dancing. It would have been very easy to set up that apparatus in an early modern theater. So, you can't disclude it. If you saw them performing by themselves throughout the countryside or even in the courts, but a group of tumblers by themselves, not licensed with or working with players, especially those traveling from Europe, then what you would expect to see is just feats of activity. You would see in the same day rope dancing, vaulting, mauling, and whatever other skill, contortion certainly, that the tumblers were capable of. And it would sort of be an all-day thing, much like we think of the circus now.
From 1578, I found a record from Hampton Court that says, quote, January 13th, Privy Council to the Lord Mayor of London, Thomas Ramsay, to give order that one Drusiano, an Italian, a comediante, and his company may play within the city and liberties of the same betwixt this and the first week of Lent. And it lists some details and then says paid 20 shillings, quote, for a mattress, hoops, and boards with trestles for the Italian tumbler. Dawn, first let's talk about this mattress, hoops, and boards mentioned in this reference. Does this indicate players were jumping through hoops and landing on mattresses? That sounds like the circus that you're talking of instead of, theater that we think of being much more formal and calm. Would Shakespeare's plays have been lively performances featuring this kind of death-defying leaps?
I don't think during the plays.
Not even the French leaping over the wall? I would love for that to be like a leap that had to have a mattress to catch somebody.
Yeah, so I was just about to say, we could certainly expect that kind of, death-defying spectacle from those few stage directions that indicate it. But I don't think, just sort of like throughout the show it was happening. I do think that it's very possible that tumblers, because another thing, that's so intrinsic to sort of the performance of various kinds of acrobatics is music. So I really wonder if that wasn't added to some of the interludes, some acrobatics along with the music. But again, I have no evidence of that. It's just having now studied the circus the way that I have, when you go to a circus, it's all music. That's what's behind the activity. So I don't think we could have quite expected those kinds of things in the theater. The trusses is particularly interesting to me because I would imagine that was to set up some kind of apparatus. And it could have been rope lisse, which is like a hanging rope, which is a rather beautiful apparatus, or tissue, which we now know as silks. So I love that because that's, apparatus work, which is what I actually do, which there's not much evidence of in the Shakespearean stage. It's one of the ways that we've brought human spectacle back into the plays that we do here at Flag Shakes. So that could have been that. But certainly in the tumbling manual that I found, the one with the most photos, there were springboards for vaulting that allowed for very significant leaping, and mattresses. I don't recall seeing another reference to. So it may be that these Italian tumblers were just a little more safety minded.
Now, you alluded to this earlier, but this reference also suggests that acrobats from Italy were traveling to London to perform for the holiday seasons, as Drusiano is specifically listed as being Italian. So was London a destination for Italian tumblers? And would they have been regarded as a separate form of entertainment from the official playing company like the King's Men, for example, or did they work together?
Yeah, there's no indication that they would have been considered the same. There's, like I said, that one reference to the Queen's Men taking on a foreign tumbler into their troupe and working with that tumbler. So that's quite interesting because we know it did happen that once at the very least. But no, mostly they were traveling to different cities and sort of following the money. So London during the Christian holiday would have made sense. And then they probably would have toured just like a modern circus through the countryside as much as they thought they could make money. And then probably throughout Europe to the bigger cities and then the countryside as much as they thought they could get a crowd to come and see and make money. So they were sort of touring as their own entity, and they had their whole own system of, travel and making money and living. It was sort of a whole lifestyle. And that's why you often see it not just as like a group of tumblers, but you'll start to realize that it was families of tumblers, and that people were traveling with their wives and their children and their brothers and their sisters. And that's really because they were living a very nomadic life, and that was their culture at the time.
Well, this is a fascinating topic, and I know we would love to explore this further, and especially in terms of how it impacts concepts like original practice and what Shakespeare would have been doing. And I wonder if you have some favorite books or resources that you can recommend we use to learn more.
Well,
only a couple thousand, right? Maybe
maybe the opposite. There are no books on early modern tumbling. I would recommend, like I said, the records of early English drama. That's one of the places where you can learn the most. Unfortunately, the one tumbling manual that I keep referencing is written in archaic French. I was able to con a professor at Mary Baldwin University into translating as much as possible of it for me. Especially, she translated all the woodcut titles for me so that I would have an idea of what was going on in the photos. I know that Darren Freeberry-Jones is going to be coming out with a book that will reference these things, but I have not found a book that references it. I would be happy to send on to anyone interested my thesis and the compilation of records I was able to come up with.
Definitely, we will link to the resources that you've recommended. And I love this idea of putting the human spectacle back into Shakespeare's plays. It's fascinating and a great reason to go and see a performance at Flagstaff Shakespeare Festival. But we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Wow, wonderful. I would definitely take Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass.
Oh, that's a great choice.
Yeah.
You'll be very well set up on your deserted island for sure.
I think between Whitman and Shakespeare, I'll have plenty to think about.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Right now, I am working on a play about a murdered a trapeze performer who was actually murdered in Stanton, Virginia, the home of the American Shakespeare Center, in 1906. And I'm working on that with my partner, Sean Golightly, who's a musician, and also with Christine Schmidla, who is the text associate at Shakespeare's Globe. So that's a working script with a lot of acrobatics and human spectacle, obviously not set quite in the 1500s, but certainly in conversation with a lot of what was going on in Shakespeare's time and Shakespeare's plays, because that's one of my touch points as a performer. So yeah, this script about, her name was Eva Howard, and she has been my subject of research for about the last 9 years, including trips to Cincinnati and Illinois and a couple other circus archives. That's really what's been keeping me busy lately, is researching her and figuring out her life and trying to put it into a play.
That sounds fascinating. Oh my goodness. I hope to see this come to fruition and that you will keep us updated so we'll know when we can go and see this performed. Yeah,
absolutely. I will keep you updated.
Well, Dawn Tucker, thank you so much for being here this week and for talking us through the Shakespeare history of acrobatics and tumbling. This is a really cool topic, and I'm so glad you took time to talk with us about it today.
Thank you so much.
To join in on this conversation with your thoughts about acrobatics in Shakespeare's England, be sure to check out today's show notes. We have links to the records for the Queen's Men, Italian acrobats, and even a few of the woodcut images in archaic French that Dawn shares with you today, all packed into the show notes for today's episode. Find all that and more at CassidyCash.com/episode 98. That's CassidyCash.com/EP98. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next Monday. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.